right. Well, thank you. I appreciate this opportunity. It's really fantastic, and so far it's been great. It's changed my thinking, and I've tried to incorporate a little bit of what happened yesterday into this talk because I couldn't sleep early this morning. I'm an anthropologist. I'm a director of environmental studies, but I'm also an anthropologist. As an anthropologist, I approach these things, more inconsistent with the way which Astrid was talking about earlier this morning, looking at governance and knowledge from sort of a different perspective. I just quickly sort of defined the way I sort of think about governance, sort of an anthropological perspective. It's something that we discover because we're trying to look from an external perspective, looking at populations, or in fact the archaeological record in my case, to try to figure out the degree to which patterns that are represented in the archaeological record and how they reflect the procedure, the behaviors, and ideas that people had in the past. So it's something that we're trying to understand from an external perspective. So I define it broadly to say it's just culturally inherited rule set for individual and group behaviors that serve to benefit group level unit of organization. And it's obviously something larger than the individual, something that benefits at a group scale, but it can be of any form. It can be both explicit in the sense of the way in which we have governance, I think sort of a traditional way we've talked about governance in some of these contexts, governmental organizations, or implicit, and essentially just what people do and however they get that information about what their rule sets are and share those things. They can be very formal, written down, or very informal. And then, of course, these things are shaped by knowledge. Governance, in an archaeological sense, is time transgressive. It's constantly changing, and it's shaped by the interactions that people have of their behaviors in the environment, and that's shaped over time by the environment and the constraints of the environment and other actors in that environment. So it's both cultural and contingency bound. And archaeologists, anthropologists study governance, partly because the governance of the past isn't the same as today, and we're interested in seeing that diversity because, of course, it represents alternatives to what we see today, which is driven largely, and sort of the capitalist scene sort of documents the fact that we've seen a reduction of the choices of governance in the world simply because of the expansion of Western governance around the world, and we need to value all the variability that can exist out there, and that's what we do as anthropologists. Knowledge, then, I sort of define quickly as the cultural inherited rationalization or ideas for why the world is the way it is. There isn't any preferential version of what that knowledge might be. It's simply the knowledge that a population has at the point in time about rationalizing why they do what they do. It's important to understand that the knowledge, when I talk about Easter Island, that my attempt to understand what's going on Easter Island isn't necessarily to reconstruct what they thought, but it's to understand why their ideas were shaped the way they were, that led to the behavior that they did. It's my construction of that understanding, and I do it from a science base, trying to look at the relationship to my ideas and the empirical record to try to figure out the best explanation for what I can see. But that also means that cultural knowledge is implicit, can be explicit or implicit, written down or not. In the case of traditional populations, it tends not to be written down, formalized. In Easter Island, there isn't a specific written record for that, but it's also contingency bound. The conditions that the people find themselves in is going to shape their knowledge about the world and their understanding about why the world works the way it does, works for the purposes that they need it to. And that may not look like the knowledge we have. And I think that's one of the challenges with Easter Island, is that the solutions that populations found themselves in don't look like the versions of solutions we sort of associate with success or proper ways of doing things. And that confusion, of course, has led to a lot of misunderstandings about Easter Island. And I'll try to clear those up today. My sort of two roles at the university, at Binghamton University, as an archaeologist, but also as director of environmental studies, where we study sustainability sort of in our curriculum, both at an undergraduate and master's level. And I try to take archaeology as a way of understanding the ways in which populations in the past succeeded or failed as lessons to be learned about how to apply that to the future. And so I want to define quickly sustainability, simply meeting the needs of the present without sacrificing the needs of the future. How did populations have long-term success? Something must have been in the knowledge that they had and the governance that they had that led them to meet the needs of that present without sacrificing the needs of the future, or they wouldn't have lasted as long as they did. So we can look at differential persistence of different kinds of combinations of ideas and governance and rules and behaviors, and see how they persisted or didn't persist, and then use that as lessons for ourselves. Now, building sustainable communities is a challenge, of course, and I'm going to highlight a couple of these things here. These are just sort of some ideas, in terms of limited resources. If you don't have infinite resources like fish, eventually you run into the challenge of, well, how do you sustain fisheries if there are no fish left to fish? Fragile social and natural environments, of course, we impact those. Historical lock-in populations simply doing the same thing because you've done it forever. Certainly it's a challenge in my own community in Binghamton, where it's very difficult to change their behavior simply because they're doing it and they've always done it, so why change anything? But the two sort of big things that we want to talk about are common pool resources and the vulnerability to change, sort of two big challenges that sort of these paradoxical things. How do we sustain something in the context of change and uncertainty, which leads to risk and danger, and sort of the two related ideas there. And how do we deal with change in the context of common pool resources? And common pool resources simply are those resources that for which communities benefit from their use. These tend to be shared resources that are difficult to control. So groundwater, air, fish are things that are difficult to manage simply because everyone has access to them. And it's easy for one actor to take over and overuse those resources. And there tends to be competition over who gets the resources the fastest, which leads to potentially catastrophic failure. And of course, this is the typical tragedy, the common story, and it's appropriate that we talked about fisheries this morning, that we do have examples of when actors are incented to take as much of the resources, the common pool resources, as possible. That leads to failure. We can look at the history of Atlantic cod fisheries off the East Coast, basically growing over time, relatively sustainable, but sort of industrial fishing that happened starting in the 60s and 70s led to a catastrophic failure of the fisheries, resulting in basically collapse of that population that's only just begun to recover. Something unthinkable for decades, and suddenly collapses and is gone, and there's virtually no cod fishery off of the coast of North America these days. So these are challenges. How do we do this? How do we build communities, community scale sustainability? How do we build these communities to be sustainable? Questions. How do we shape our communities so that they can meet this definition of sustainability, meet the needs of the present without sacrificing the needs of the future? How do we mitigate uncertainty in resource productivity? Now, this is, of course, about change. And when we think about climate change, we know that whatever is going to happen is going to be more variable and less certain. And we have to build communities that are able to be resilient, adaptive, and systems that are able to deal with the fact that the world is changing around us. How do we mitigate that uncertainty? And how do we deal with it? How do we manage common pool resources, particularly these kinds of resources, which then affect everyone? That the loss of them is catastrophic to the community. And then to what degree does sustainability require top-down types of governance? There's a lot of assumption, I think, at least in archaeology, that when we see governance structures, sort of large-scale behavior, community-scale structure, that there's somebody in charge, and that, and certainly the belief among many people that, the government should take care of things. But what to what degree can we construct things such that smaller scale units can collaborate together to create the community scale phenomenon that we're looking for, these sustainable communities. Sustainable communities can't just depend on top-down governance to say, you will behave this way. We need actors to work together to cooperate and coordinate themselves in order to have that emerge at the scale that we're interested in. So we need both things, and what degree can we look at the bottom-up perspective. Now, so I'm going to talk about Easter Island as a case study here. And I'm going to argue that Rapa Nui, the native word for Easter Island, provides lessons from the past for our future in ways that are not you may not be familiar with, vary from the traditional story. Let me introduce Easter Island really quickly. It's in the middle of nowhere from a global perspective. Out here, about 2,000 miles, 2,500 miles off the coast of Chile, 2,000 miles from any other speck of land on the island. Really something that's isolated in the middle of the ocean, and there's really nothing. There's no other islands around it. Once you get to this island, that's it. That's your entire universe. And it's a tiny island. It's about 6 by 10 miles. When you land on the island, there's an airstrip in the southeast corner. You can stand on the island and see all the sides of the island in one shot. You can walk around it in a long day. That's it. It's a remarkably isolated and teeny tiny place. To get a sense of the scale, but here's Heidelberg. We can plop Easter Island down on top of it. And it's not much bigger than Heidelberg. So imagine, especially as grad students who are stuck here in Heidelberg, realizing that if your entire universe was Heidelberg, it would be just like being on Easter Island. So it's this really tiny, tiny place that's really remote. Yet we find some spectacular archaeological features there. I mean, really paradoxically large and elaborate. These statues are called Moai. They're multi-ton lithic statues that are carved by native people, and they have massive hats on top of them called pukao. And there's nearly 1,000 of these statues on the island, which is kind of mind-boggling. If you found one of these statues, say in my community, Binghamton, or here in Heidelberg, it would be a world monument, right? Everyone would see the statue, and you would see the giant megalith of Heidelberg. Here, there's nearly 1,000 of these things. So here's this tiny speck of land in the middle of the Pacific, not much resources around it, no other place to go, yet they're making these massive statues. It's sort of mind-blowing and hard to understand. And these things really are huge. Sort of hard to appreciate when you just see a photo of them. You get a sense, all the statues are full bodies. People talk about the heads of Easter Island, but in fact, that's just people just looking at the ones that are buried in which the bodies are subsurface. They're all full statues. And they can be up to 30 feet high or 10 meters tall. And weigh up to 70 tons. Just massive, massive constructions. Now, Easter Island has become sort of synonymous with a lot of environmental movement things, simply because of the story that this behavior, this making of these statues, isn't something that makes a lot of sense. And it certainly doesn't on the surface of it. Like, why would these people, of all people or in the world, have spent that much effort making these gigantic statues? Certainly they didn't have a lot of spare resources. Why would they go to the trouble of doing this? And there's been a lot of speculation about this idea over the past several hundred years. And the most recent version of sort of this characterizing this story comes from Jared Diamond, who's borrowing from other people, that he argues that Easter Island is an example in which populations, by making these statues in sort of this cultural exuberance, consumed resources, leading to destruction of themselves. And he calls this ecocide. And he says this argument is that, I guess that's overlapping there, that Rapa Nui, or Easter Island, is the clearest example of a society that destroyed itself by overexploiting its own resources. And of course, that's one of our concerns today. If we think environmentally, we want to figure out solutions that prevent us or keep us from consuming all of the resources we have, leading to its potential destruction. And here, Jared Diamond argues that this is a good example of a case in which populations did just that, and we can study that and say, well, let's not be like them. Let's do something different. And it's a good case of sort of a scary parable of our potential future. This image here is from there's a great movie, I mean, it's a pretty terrible movie, but called Rapa Nui, that was produced by Kevin Costner. That's not a Rapa Nui guy, that's Jason Scott Lee, who's sitting there sadly looking at the trees that were chopped down across the island, wondering what happened to the island, why did we chop all these trees down, aren't we sad now? The terrible part of the movie, it's filmed on Rapa Nui, which is beautiful, but the terrible part of the movie, he gets on an iceberg and floats away to escape the island at the end, which is the terrible part. So that's the story. And many people know about this story about Easter Island, the sort of collapse narrative of Easter Island. It certainly resonates with a lot of environmental fears and concerns that we have. And it's certainly a good, scary bedtime parable to tell people, let's not do that. But is it true? And that's part of, as scientists, we want to understand, is there evidence to support this narrative? Because it matters, right? If people are making policy based on the idea that this Easter Island catastrophe story could happen, has happened, and could happen, then we really want to know the details of that. Exactly how did that unfold? How did people start out? Not necessarily, they couldn't possibly have started out wanting to destroy themselves. They probably got there thinking, this is a great island, and then something happened, and we want to figure that out. We should understand that. And certainly, that's my colleague Terry Hunt and I went to the island. Trying to figure out how did this story unfold? How did this collapse narrative unfold and turn into what we thought initially was certainly true? What we found through the course of about 15 years of work is that the story isn't true at all, and that this narrative is false. It's sort of a misunderstanding of what actually went on there. And we've learned a number of things that we now really know about the island itself. A lot of things that people think they know about the island turn out to just be stories. that have been told and retold over time without any empirical basis. Some of it is based on false information, a lot of assumptions, etc. But now there's 5 things I can talk about sort of out of all the things we've learned that really shape the story itself. So we can re-envision this story about Rapa Nui prehistory. They relate to the nature of prehistoric collapse itself, the post-contact events, what happens after Europeans arrive there. Europeans get there in 1722, and different things happen. The population size and structure, the nature of the population, how they're distributed across the island, the nature of the natural resources of the island, sort of productivity of the island itself prior to humans getting there, and how that changes. And then the Moai, the statues themselves and the resources required to move them. So things that we now really know about the island that really aren't about speculation, but certainly the evidence. The first important one, there is simply no evidence to support a prehistoric demographic collapse on Rapa Nui. Now, one of the big arguments about ecocide is that populations get to the island, they start chopping trees down, they start consuming resources, and at some point they run out of resources and the population collapses, all prior to Europeans arriving. And what Europeans see when they arrive in 1722 is a post-collapse environment and post-collapse population that's depleted, has small numbers of people who aren't doing very well, and it's a result of this after this event. Well, when we look at the archaeological record, we look at looking for evidence of this demographic collapse, we simply don't find any evidence of a prehistoric population. In fact, the earliest historic accounts describe populations as being healthy, providing food for the original Europeans. Really no problems whatsoever. Things being Moai being constructed, things were happening, and then Europeans arrive and things drastically change. So the first thing, there's no evidence of it. And I can show you a couple of things that are assumed to be evidence. The second thing that's important is that the 18th century European contact on Rapa Nui was catastrophic. And this is a story that's been told around the world. When two isolated populations encounter each other, there can be the transfer of diseases, which can lead to a demographic collapse. And this happens over and over again. In North America, for example, Eastern North America was depopulated, probably 99% population loss within about 50 years. So North America goes from several million people prehistorically to a fraction of that in about 50 years, often long prior to Europeans systematically getting to any of the places that they see. So what Europeans initially bring diseases to them, population declines. They then arrive into the environment after this population's collapse, see an empty place and go, oh, this is a great place to go colonize. It's been waiting for us, not realizing that they had already impacted the populations. Populations are lost to this misconception. I mean, this leads to a lot of sort of interesting implications about our understanding about the native forests and the old primal forests, or actually many in like North America are actually post-contact forests that grew up in the absence of people and aren't really primal forests, that these are things, an accident of the interaction that happens at disease. This seems to be the case on Easter Island. We have good documentation of this based on historic records that when Europeans arrived there, populations declined. When Jacob Roggeveen arrives in 1722, he describes about 3,000 people. He describes them as healthy. In fact, he describes the island as being an earthly paradise that just required a little bit of tidying up and would be perfectly fine for people. He doesn't really describe any problems whatsoever. It's after that we start to see systematic decrease in population descriptions. The Spanish arrive 50 years later. James Cook describes populations that are sick, skeletons laying around, sort of this something happened, bad happened here. He does, of course, isn't aware of what might have happened. This is pre-germ theory. Europeans have no idea the effect that they have on populations that they're visiting. And then over time, population estimates are certainly not systematic, and they vary. But generally, they start to decline. In 1877, there are just 111 Rapa Nui people on the island. Now, it's important to understand that day is important to understand because a lot of our anthropological and archaeological understanding of the island comes from researchers going to the island in the early 20th century. So 1917, Kathleen Rutledge, for example, is one of the first researchers to sort of collect oral traditions, describe the conditions of the island. She's seeing an island that has been transformed by disease radically and doesn't recognize that at all. It's a quite different place. So what she's collecting is sort of the remnants of founder's effect of the population that survived the 111 reduction of population. Today there are about 4,000 Rapa Nui people on the island and scattered around the world. They've all descended from this original 111 people. The other part that people don't recognize is the fact that in the 1870s, about this time, the island gets turned into a sheep ranch. Charter is given to the William Balfour Scottish Sheep Ranching Company, and the island is home to 60,000 sheep. And Rapa Nui people are bound to work on the island as slaves, and only let out of their village in order to work on the sheep ranch. Which, of course, the sheep drastically change the environment, cause erosion, and a lot of those effects of the sheep ranch get interpreted as being something that happened prehistorically, but we now really know that most of those things happen as post-contact. So it's a lot of understanding. Now, there's the misunderstandings go from, sort of simple, as people see things like this and say, well, this is evidence of that collapse. These are Moai, the statues themselves, and this is the way the Moai look in historic times. So if you go there to the island today, most of the Moai that you see are actually fallen down like this. And one might argue that this is evidence of collapse itself, like the fallen down statues. And part of Jared Diamond's argument is that populations, as they ran out of resources, got mad at each other and started pushing each other's Moai down, and said, screw you, I'm going to take your food and push your Moai down. And that's the result of this. This is evidence of that warfare and that combat. Well, when we actually look at the historic records, we see kind of quite a different story. Jacob Roggeveen in 1722 doesn't describe any toppled Moai at all. He talks about how tall the Moai are, how high they are. He measures them. He talks about the height. He doesn't describe a single fallen statue. The Spanish are the same way. They talk about the height of the Moai. It's James Cook who starts to see the first fallen Moai. He talks about standing Moai and talks about how he has lunch underneath the shadow of one. 16 men have lunch in the shadow of a Moai in the afternoon. But he also talks about fallen statue. And over time, the statues get fewer and fewer in number that are standing, and more and more of them fallen, until about 1868, where there's simply no standing statues. So all the fallen statues that we see across the island appear to have been largely fallen in a post-contact context, not in a pre-European contact. So what looks like a collapsed landscape in which all this terrible stuff happened in these wars is actually something that's the result of European interaction, population loss, and a lot of interesting changes that were going on socially and economically with the Rapa Nui people. So that's sort of, the thing that's the obvious evidence of the collapse simply becomes, no, this is really explicable in a historic context and well documented in that regard. So collapse itself is post-contact. So there is collapse. I mean, and Jared Diamond's guns, germs, and steel story is certainly consistent with what we see here. There is an impact, but it's post-European. The other important thing that we've learned is the human population was never particularly large in prehistory. Now, human population sizes are difficult to estimate in the archaeological record. We just have rocks of different sorts scattered around. And so understanding population numbers isn't a simple, there's no simple formula for doing that. But when we look at the distribution of artifacts across the island, we find the fact that there's sort of a continuous distribution of artifacts, domestic artifacts across the island, pointing to the fact that populations didn't live in concentrated villages with intense cultivation, but lived in dispersed settlement systems, basically using all the usable parts of the island in a low-density fashion. And it's really not consistent with this idea of intense cultivation, maximizing population sizes. In fact, when we look at sort of the numbers of space in which people can really grow food in a productive fashion, given slope and soil quality, et cetera, we get a number that's not that far off from about 3,000, which is the numbers that Roggeveen saw. So Roggeveen may have actually seen a fully intact, functioning population that was small, but right-sized for the island itself. Now the puzzle then becomes, well, how did such a small population have made all those statues? And part of the argument about the statues and part of the argument about the population sizes is that it must have been much, much bigger, because how else could such a small number of people have made so many gigantic statues? And the argument that Diamond has about there being 10,000, 15,000, or 20,000 people on the island partly comes from the idea that there must have been 10,000 to 20,000 people on the island simply to explain the statues. It doesn't come from data. It simply comes from an assumption that that must have been the case, because that's all he can figure out is to explain the statues themselves. So but when we look at the evidence in terms of the numbers of population, of domestic artifacts and their distributions and the density of those, we really get a different number. It's very small, which then opens this paradox. Well, how did they make those statues, which we need to explain separately. We also don't see any evidence of chiefs or elite. A lot of assumptions, you see statues like this and you think, well, why would anybody do that unless someone told them to do it? Like, make me a big statue. It must be the only reason why anyone would possibly make a statue. And partly, this argument that Diamond has is there's this top-down chiefs who are demanding that more statues be made in order to build up their prestige or something like that. And that, that sort of ego thing leads to this catastrophe. But when we look at the artifacts and the distributions of food and the constraint of resources and how resources are moving across the island, we don't find any control of resources whatsoever. Everyone has equal access to literally everything. And there isn't that much on the island. The island itself has different kinds of rocks, and that's about it. There isn't much else to constrain. In fact, and we don't see any control of those resources in any particular way. We don't see anybody, other than potentially age distribution, where elders are probably given some preferential treatment. Certainly when Europeans arrive, when they ask where the chief is, they push the oldest guy in front and say, this is the guy. But that doesn't seem to be associated with economic power of any sort. What we find is, clan-level organization, very localized clan-level organization, replicated across the island by many, many different clans. Not a single island-wide organization, but many small-scale organizations across the island. We also see that the natural environment of the Rapa Nui was always relatively poor. Now, part of the argument that Diamond has is that prior to humans getting there, this island was a paradise that had all these flightless birds and had these, all this great resources, and then humans wrecked it. Well, when we look carefully at the soils themselves, we find, in fact, the soils were never productive. This is an old volcanic island. It dates to eruptions that are about 1 million years old. It's relatively quite a bit of rainfall on the island that actually pulls the nutrients out of the soil, leading to very non-productive soils. The soils themselves have been described by soil scientists as having the productivity of a brick. There was just not very much to them. Probably they were most productive when trees were there, but trees had bound most of those nutrients in the trunks themselves. The soils themselves weren't natively particularly productive. But we do know that there were trees there, and this is an important point that of course, is often used as evidence for collapse, is that prior to humans being there, this island was covered with some kind of palm forest. The trees were Chilean wine palms, or related to them at least, Jubea chilensis. These are very large palms that live up several hundred years in age, take a long time to mature, it's up to 70 years to actually fruit, that were covered in the island. And we know that, in fact, that at the point in which Europeans arrive, there's certainly almost no palm trees, if none at all. There's some evidence that there were some palms still left at that point in time, and that the sheep did them off. But certainly there wasn't the numbers that may have existed prehistorically. And since researchers who have done some estimations on the numbers of trees, some German researchers argue that there were something like 20 million palm trees on the island. That's like every square foot would be a palm tree. But even if there were just 1 million trees on the island, there were a lot, and then at some point there were none. And there's a big ecological change. And we certainly know that's the case. There's no question about that. By the time Europeans arrived, they're certainly few in number, and they noticed that. The question is that loss of the forest a catastrophic event or not? A lot of that is understanding the nature of palm trees themselves and the nature of that transformation of the island from one that was wooded with these palms into something else that we see currently. What we find is actually a very interesting strategy by populations. The loss of the forest takes several hundred years. It's not an instant event. It slowly expands across the island. The forest seems to be denuded both from slash and burn cultivation, so they're burning the forest, which of course is releasing nutrients into the soil to allow them to grow food, just like slash and burn cultivationists do around the world. And certainly Polynesians were slash and burn cultivationists, so this is a tradition that they would have done. We also see the impact that the rats had. The rats introduced by Polynesians were the first teeth on the island. They love palm nuts. These are arboreal rats that live up in the forest. So they're going to make it difficult for the forest to regenerate simply because they would eat the nuts. And we see sort of this loss of the forest that happens over several hundred years. What we don't see is a catastrophe as a result of that. We don't see massive erosion effects. The soil was never particularly productive. It doesn't get any less productive. It's certainly not more productive as it loses the soils. But we find, in fact, is that the trees are being replaced by gardens. Now, the problem about the gardens is that people, when Europeans first get to the island, they don't see what they consider farms. They look across this island like this and they say, what a terrible environment. What are all those rocks doing there? And if we wanted a field, we should get rid of those rocks and have nice furrows for our crops. Turns out that these rock distributions are the gardens. Lithic mulching is a means of actually enriching the soil by breaking up bedrock and exposing it, fresh bedrock surfaces to the soil so that you can get some increase of nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in the soil to grow crops. What we find is, in fact, that in these rock mulch gardens, which are all culturally constructed, I mean, billions and billions of rocks broken, distributed across the landscape, actually enhance the environment to produce enough nutrients to reliably grow sweet potatoes. And sweet potatoes turn out to be the largest part of prehistoric diet on the island. This introduced plant, tuber plant, needs enough nutrients to grow, and the mulch gardens provide that. So what we see, instead of a catastrophe in the loss of the forest, is actually a transformation of the forest from one that was not particularly productive for humans into one that's actually producing reliable foodstuffs for humans through sweet potato farming. So lithic mulch gardening is something that people didn't recognize. It just wasn't something that a European would notice. People puzzled, where was the farm for all the island? Europeans in the 1930s speculated that there was another island that sank, like Atlantis, and all kinds of speculation, simply because people had no idea that these things that were in front of them were in fact the productive food sources of populations. So that understanding has really transformed thinking about the island itself. And the island that looked like this desolate landscape that was full of rocks and this horrible surface is actually a very productive one created by Rapa Nui people in order to support themselves. So very different from this collapse narrative. And when we look at the distribution from satellite imagery, we can see sort of the scattered distribution of rock mulch garden in sort of variable density in red and blue there. The fifth thing that we learned is that the statues did not take massive numbers of people to move. In fact, they were ingeniously manufactured in order to walk. Now, when I say walk, I don't mean simply in this walk sense, but literally in a walk sense, that they literally walked. And we did some research, basically looked at the statues themselves to try to figure out the conditions that would have necessarily led to, that would best explain the ideas that would best explain why the statues had the shape and form that they do. And what we learned is that the statues vary in their form, and that statues that were on their way to the platforms where they ended up have this amazing forward lean, so far forward that they don't even stand up on their own. And it was a puzzle to us. Why would you make a statue that you were transporting that wouldn't stand up? Isn't that sort of the opposite of what you want for a statue? So we were challenged by NOVA to do an experiment to see, well, could we actually figure out why they were in this forward lean, leading to this statues. And we did this. Oh, it's down here. Yeah. Quickly go through this. So we figured out, basically demonstrated that the statues are actually manufactured in such a way to provide the mechanism for moving them with the least number of people, with the least number of resources. It didn't require trees or rollers. It simply required rope, which there was plenty of that plant material on the island, that allowed them to move in a very efficient fashion. I can show you more of that image. So they were able to move. This is a 5-ton replica. We were able to move it 100 meters in about 30 minutes. It's on a prepared road surface. It's sort of a simplest case. But the statues on Rapa Nui were moved across prepared road surfaces themselves in a similar fashion. And it certainly explains the pattern of breakage, the pattern of their falling, their pattern distribution across the island as being moved in this standing position with small numbers of people very efficiently. And we estimate that people could have moved statues if they prepared the road surface in advance, up to 1 kilometer a day, that the numbers of 1,000 statues, of which there's about 400 that are outside of the quarry, were certainly completely possible in the scheme of things. It didn't require massive numbers of people. It simply required local organization, family-scale organization, to invest in these resources. So that's what we now know. And what we've learned generally, and I'm going to try to finish up here, is that there were 500 years of persistence of this island that had really this remote and tiny, this remote and tiny island. Now, the question we have to challenge ourselves is why would they have done this? If the story now is success, why would they have made the statue? How was Rapa Nui sustainable despite its remote location and limited resources? If there wasn't a collapse and people were successful and lived there for 500 years and did so, how were they able to do that? And the answer that we've come up with is, in fact, it's the Moai. That these cooperative efforts, bottom up from small-scale cooperative efforts, lead to well-managed shared resources with mitigated competition and benefits at all scales. that we're actually finding that it's the benefits. The statues themselves are kind of a byproduct of the cooperation that served the community to bind it together to allow it to withstand, to share resources, to deal with shortfalls that happen inevitably on an island with limited with very limitations and no alternatives to the resources that were available on the island. That the statues themselves are really the secret to the island. I can talk more about some of the details behind that model, but I'll just finish it up there and say we've really sort of changed this story, but I think there's a lot more to be learned by studying statues in this capacity. It makes more sense. From an island perspective, this is the way in which you bring your community together to ensure that you've got cooperation, to validate that people are participating, to weed out defectors, to provide both the cooperation and the coordination that's required to have a collaborative group environment. It doesn't require top-down at all, and it provides very stable success over a long time. Whether or not populations would have persisted past the 500 years is a little hard to say, but they certainly did so quite well up until European contact, and things radically altered after that. There's a lot of good models to be had from here in terms of these are the kinds of things that we could implement in communities to bring them together to serve our purpose, that we could invent traditions in this way and learn a lot from the Rapa Nui people. So thank you.